All right, so we're going to get started with our last History in the Kitchen of 2020. If you have been enjoying this program, it will come back in the future. We're working on our spring 2021 calendar, and I'm hoping I'll have some dates for History in the Kitchen for you very shortly. As we get started with this program, just a reminder, my name is Lacey Villava. I will be your chef today. I'm joined by Laura and Rachel, who are both experts in people who were not the Masons nor enslaved here at Gunston Hall. These are people who were tenant farmers, indentured servants, who had a variety of tasks and jobs throughout the property and on the land that George Mason leased to others. So they're going to help me be chatting about what we're talking about today and the dish that we're making, which is pumpkin fritters. Now, if you didn't get a chance to prepare a fresh pumpkin, I've got my fresh prepared pumpkin right here. You can also do this recipe with a can of pureed pumpkin. It works just as well. The texture is just a little bit different, but it's still a great dish. So I'm gonna dig in, get started, get some of my ingredients ready. Laura, can you pop up on the screen the historic recipe that we're using today so everyone can get a chance to take a look at it? And it is the morning of technical difficulties. We apologize. So it may take just a moment for Laura to get that up on screen. While she's doing that, I'm going to open up my can of pumpkin so I can get started working with it. So Laura's got the supplies list up on the screen just in case you need a reminder. It's also downloadable on our website along with the full ingredients list and full recipe. Laura, if you could pop the link for that recipe into the chat, please, that would be fantastic. It may take her just a moment to get that done, but we'll get that there in just a sec. Not my favorite can opener, but also not my least favorite can opener. Laura, can you flip screens and let us take a look at the historic recipe up there?
Absolutely. Give me one moment. Ta-da, there you are.
So we've got this great historic recipe. I want you to take a look at this. See if there's anything in here that stands out for you. Is it different than what you were expecting? Is it the same? Take a look at it, take a few moments, and either shout out or pop into the chat. What are some things that you think are interesting about this recipe?
Yeah, we've already got a comment about frying it in lard.
Yeah, we're not frying it in lard today. We're going to be using vegetable oil, although lard and butter were the two most common frying mediums as far as I'm aware in the 18th century.
Also surprised that they made waffles back then.
Yeah, we've got a great waffle iron here at Gunston Hall. Unfortunately, I can't use it in our modern kitchen, but we will hopefully be able to get you guys out there to see that at some point in the future. You can also check out a really cool video on YouTube. Townsend's did a video with us a number of years ago where we made those waffles in our historic kitchen. It was really fun. Anybody else have any other thoughts?
We have some comments about them using leftovers, the fact that the recipe mentions specifically leftover from dinner.
Absolutely. Laura, Rachel, Holly, you have less experience with this, although I'm sure you have thoughts and feelings about it too. They use leftovers a lot. I'm sure Rachel, Laura, you can think of some. Do either of you have a preferred 18th century recipe that uses leftovers?
Leftover potatoes in everything.
That was exactly where my thought went. I immediately thought, yeah, leftover potatoes, because you can save them, you can reuse them. I also thought of kush, which is often a recipe that's connected to enslaved people that reuses old cornmeal. So whether it be kind of like a cornbread, you can take this dried older stuff, crumble it up, and then reuse it.
One of my favorite ones is chicken pudding. You use a roasted chicken, what remains of a roasted chicken, and you put it in a batter. This is not a pudding like what we think of today. It is a savory kind of spoon bread type texture that you use pre-cooked chicken in as the protein.
My
That is
favorite food.
my favorite dish. Isn't it great, Rachel? I love that one.
Yep.
Do we have?
We have a question about the leftovers. Would the leftover pumpkins have been cooked plain from dinner? Had any spices that might have been left over from the previous cooking?
It is entirely possible that they would have had spices previously. If we're talking about people like tenant farmers, indentured servants, maybe not. Pumpkin was often, a lot of vegetables were often sent up to table sort of crisp tender with lots of butter on the maintenance table. Salt and butter, yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
Oh, one person did comment about the lack of precise measurements, that the brown sugar is 1 or more tablespoons rather than a hard measurement.
Though the tablespoon itself is pretty precise.
Yes, yeah. By comparison to some 18th century recipes, that is fairly precise. But not always. That's not always the case in 18th century recipes. In our very first History in the Kitchen, we talked about slow versus quick ovens. That is the bane of making 18th century recipes in modern kitchens. It's really hard for us to tell exactly what they meant. So Rachel and Laura and I do archaeology basically with 18th century recipes to try to figure out how they went together and what they tasted like so that we can bring recipes like this one to you.
We make a lot of bad food.
We do.
We make a lot of bad food, but we also have to remember that some of their tastes were different than ours. So sometimes, like one really good example is for a cocktails by candlelight event we did last year. We had a spinach dish that was sweet instead of savory, and it turned a lot of heads.
And we left a lot of sugar out of that one. Didn't we end up leaving half the sugar out of that one? And it was still extremely sweet. Very sweet spinach pie.
Well, let's dig into this recipe. Laura, if you haven't already gotten that link in the chat, if you'll drop that in. Yep. And we will get started with making our pumpkin fritters. So I'm gonna switch over to my other camera. Laura, once you get to the point where you can take down the screen share, if you'll flip over to the overhead cam so we can get a nice close-up view of what I'm doing in the bowls over here.
Absolutely.
While Laura is working on that, I'm actually making 2 different versions of the pumpkin fritters today. I'm going to do it with our pureed pumpkin, and I am going to do it with our fresh pumpkin. So I'm getting ready to add a cup of fresh and pureed pumpkin to each of these 2 bowls. And if at any time y'all have questions about how this goes together, what this should be looking like, food in the 18th century, George Mason, any of that, give a shout in the chat, and Laura or Rachel can read it out, and one or the other of us will address it. All right, there's my cup of fresh pumpkin. I'm gonna dump that in this bowl.
We've had a question, do we need 2 bowls?
If you are making just fresh or just pureed, no. If you want to make both versions and do a comparison test for yourself, yeah, then you want 2 bowls. But if you only want to make one version, that's up to you. I'm doing both so you can see what it looks like.
If I'm not mistaken, canned pumpkin is usually a different species of pumpkin than the sugar kind of pumpkins that we usually use to cook with.
That's true. Laura and I did test this recipe though for you to make sure that this would work out. They do have slightly different textures. This is also really properly pureed, and this is also mashed. So there's texture-wise, there isn't a huge amount of difference until you actually start pureeing. I believe some of these pumpkin, this is also not just pumpkin in some of them. They add, this one happens to be, but some of them add colorants to get this nice bright orange color. Okay, so next step is my eggs. So it is 1 egg. If you are doing just one of these 2 dishes, you need just 1 egg today. But if you are doing both like I am, you'll want an egg in each bowl.
Actually, in the 18th century, looking at a lot of these recipes, we don't actually know what they were calling a pumpkin. A pumpkin could have been, depending on who was writing the recipe, any winter squash.
Right, so it could be acorn squash or butternut. There's a really interesting pumpkin that shows up in some 18th century recipes called a sweet potato pumpkin. I desperately want to know what that is. There is a modern vegetable called a sweet potato pumpkin. It does not match the description of the one that I have seen in the 18th century recipe. Okay, so the egg is mixed into that one. And into that one. I'm gonna start turning on my stove because I know this stove is not a particularly quick one and I just wanna have time for my pan to heat up. So I'm turning it on right now about medium heat. I'll probably turn it down a little bit when I get ready to start cooking. Laura, I failed to print out my ingredients list. I'm doing a cup of milk in each, that's right?
It's a half cup of milk.
Thank you, glad I checked. Half cup of milk. Laura and I tested this recipe the other day for you just to make sure that it was going to turn out very well for your experiment today. And we adjusted some of the ingredients measurements because we determined that what we had initially had wasn't quite right. So this is going to be very liquidy with all of the milk stirred in. We're angling for something like a pancake batter. So once I got all the liquid stirred in, we'll add our flour and get it to that pancake battery state. So you can see there, that's what our fresh pumpkin looks like. You can see the fibers of the pumpkin in it still, whereas this one that I'm stirring up right now will be very smooth when it's done. So Rachel, Laura, you've both interpreted people who were indentured or tenant farmers in the past. And we know they're growing lots of different kinds of pumpkin. What are some of the other winter vegetables that they're growing this time of year?
I didn't want to cut you off, Rachel, if you wanted to.
Well, the squash, our winter squash are great because you can keep them in the root cellar over the winter along with your cabbages and your potatoes and your turnips. Though your turnips you can actually just keep right there in the ground. You don't even need to take them out. Laura, did you ever force a pumpkin The way
I
that
have not. I've read lots about it, but I have yet to do it myself.
the way you can force a cabbage, you can also force a pumpkin, and it's quite delicious. Which
My mom, who I believe has actually identified herself in chat today, has pictures of a forced pumpkin that I made.
so
Oh.
and to force a cabbage or a pumpkin or anything else, you basically it's almost like a meatball batter with rice, depending on where you're interpreting. If you had rice and you put it inside either your cabbage or your pumpkin or whatever, or your other vegetable, and stuff it in there, and then just put it over the fire and let it cook. And Lacey is putting in her brown sugar.
Yep, tablespoon for each bowl if you're doing 2 bowls, or 1 tablespoon in the bowl that you're making.
Yeah, and it's interesting that they use the term force because it's also used in terms of force meat, which is essentially a meatball. So they use the same word to describe what they're doing to meat as what they're doing to a vegetable.
Well,
So
the force
around 18th century cooking.
I think forced meat comes from the fact that they use meatball stuffing to shove into lots of things in the 18th century. Everything from vegetables to poultry to there's one recipe called to stuff a chine of pork, which you take a pork roast, you kind of slice it open, and then you fill it with meatball material. Okay, so I've got my brown sugar into each of those. I measured out my flour in advance, but it's half a cup of flour to each bowl. I can smell my pan starting to get hot, so I'm going to turn that down just a little bit. And I am going to stir my flour in. So if it looks a little bit thick on your end, you can always add a little bit more milk or a little water to thin it out. If it looks a little bit thin, add just a tablespoon or so more flour until it gets to a consistency that looks like a thick pancake batter. It's going to be lumpy. It's never going to quite smooth out if you're making the fresh pumpkin, because you can probably see you've still got all of the fibers of the pumpkin in here. The canned pumpkin will smooth out and become a really, really smooth batter. Oh, I just realized I neglected to get out a plate to put the finished fritters on. I'm gonna have to fix that in just a second. So does anybody have any thoughts or questions at this point?
I'm just sitting here staring at your batter, being like, I could drive to Gunston and eat it.
I wish we could have volunteers back here. That's one of my least favorite things about COVID and virtual programs, is that we're not able to have all of our people here with us. All right, so I've got just a few more lumps I want to stir out in this one. It's looking really good. I can tell my pan is nice and hot. So in a second, I'm going to go grab my plate to put my finished fritters on.
We've had a question. What would the fritters be served with?
Great question. I don't know. I realized you got smoothed out for me. Thanks, Laura. I didn't use them. Fritters could be served with butter, with honey. Maple syrup isn't something that we're using a lot of here in Virginia in the 18th century, although if you want to have maple syrup on them today, I think that would be a great addition personally. Laura, Rachel, thoughts?
I'm so sorry, I was typing out. What can we pair with it?
I also think that though a tenant farmer perhaps might not have nutmeg and cinnamon and your basic pumpkin spice, those also might be a nice addition to your batter.
Absolutely. When I tested this out with somebody here at Gunston Hall, that was her first response was, "Oh, I think it needs a little cinnamon." And I'm like, you can do that. It is your batter. This is my test batch, and I'm following the recipe.
And we're in the 21st century now, where it's very easy and relatively cheap to get a hold of those spices. I would think too, it's interesting. One of the things too is that we've used brown sugar in our recipe today. And that's something that would have been more available to, someone who was, they did not use the term working class, but someone who is of this lower income bracket. But you could also sweeten it with things like molasses or even honey. So you have different things that you can try out with yours. A lot of these 18th century recipes are not set in stone. They're very much meant to be flexible and adaptable to individual people's means and what's available to them.
Right, can y'all see those fritters in the pan? I started with the fresh pumpkin, and I'm going to do one round of the fresh pumpkin, and then I'll do a round of the pumpkin puree. And so you can see the comparison. The fresh pumpkin is going to be a little bit more loose. It's not going to puff as much. The pureed pumpkin, the batter tends to be a little bit more, it has a texture more like pudding. It will sort of look not cooked once you get it cooked, but I promise it is. I'm looking here on the edges of my fritters for the edges to be, to firm up and to darken, and for bubbles to start to appear in the middle of the fritters. I haven't quite gotten that yet. The edges are starting to firm up here. I can see they're turning a little bit white on the fresh fritters, but they're not quite there yet.
So I have two things. One is a cooking question. How much oil did you put in the pan?
About a tablespoon.
Okay, so about a tablespoon. And then the second one was a history question about who would be eating this. Would the Masons be served this? Would enslaved people be eating this?
So it's likely that people of all classes of society in the 18th century were eating something like pumpkin fritters. Fritters of all kinds appear in cookbooks, everything from strawberry fritters to pumpkin to potato. There are tons of varieties of fritters in 18th century recipes. This happens to be one that we believe is more accessible to somebody of a lower social class, a lower social level. In the 18th century, they would have been called the middling sort, or perhaps even the lower sort. And those are people who are indentured, people who are free but not particularly well-to-do, people who are tenant farmers. So they have access to these things. They're able to produce flour, produce eggs, produce milk right in their own spaces, grow pumpkins themselves, which is why you don't see us adding things like cinnamon and nutmeg. They're less accessible to that social level.
And you could easily switch the milled flour with cornmeal, and these would be work just as well.
Right. But for the Masons, they're absolutely, if they were having these fritters, they would absolutely be served with a ton of butter, possibly with honey on them, and they would be a side dish at a larger meal. Whereas for people who are tenant farmers or who are indentured servants, this might be the side dish to the main dish. And like, that's the two dishes that they're having in their meal.
Yeah, like a really great example of a similar recipe like this that's very much a traveler through classes is something called hoe cakes or Johnny cakes, where they're a cornmeal kind of pancake. And we know that people of all levels of society are eating this, but Washington in particular mentions how much he likes them. And one of his step-grandchildren records the recipe, but she also mentions that he eats his swimming in butter and honey. And so clearly this is that's a very upper class version of something that would have been easy to cook and accessible for all levels of society. So yeah, for everywhere, any kind of version of something you can fry that has a basic batter is an everyone kind of dish.
Yeah, I've made that hoe cake recipe. It's really easy, although it does require a ferment period. It's got yeast in it, and you let them sit overnight so that they get nice and puffy. But they are so good.
It's the difference between, different social classes, it's the difference between getting the fast food takeout version of a burger and then going to a really upscale gastro pub and getting a burger there. Like that's kind of what we see with these dishes, is even though they all go by the similar name, depending on how it's being prepared and who it's being prepared for, it can be very different.
All right, so there's my first batch of fresh pumpkin fritters off the fire and on that white plate there. I don't know if I'm still spotlighted on that plate.
Yep, I still have your kitchen oven set up spotlighted, so.
Okay. So you can see these are still very yellow, but they've got a nice brown on them. The pie pumpkin, the pureed pumpkin, is going to come out a lot darker. And they are going to, these you can see spread quite a bit. If you're doing the pumpkin puree, they're going to stay a lot more the shape that they initially started in, because of the fact that the pumpkin is already pureed. There's a lot more density to it. You can see this one is just a lot more liquidy. This one's a lot more firm. So they come out slightly differently, but sadly I can't eat them personally. I'm gluten-free, but I have heard good things about them from my taste testers. Right, Laura?
Yeah, can confirm, very tasty. Even without spices, they're very enjoyable, but if you spice them a little bit, I think it would take them to kind of that next level. So we have two questions. One is about our preparation. So for the fresh pumpkin, did you mash it or pass it through a sieve as is asked for in recipes?
In this recipe, it did not indicate passing through a sieve, so I did just mash it. There are other recipes that would pass it through a sieve, and you would get much more like this puree texture that we see here. But I was playing with the recipe still. You're seeing history in action here. The research that we do in order to make recipes like this one come to life. So great question, but just mashed today.
And then our second question is there a recipe book you can recommend with some of the historic recipes you have mentioned?
If you're looking to,
This is hard. I'll tell you while she's thinking. So we actually use a variety of cookbooks for our work when we put together any kind of menu for a program. We do have a couple favorites that we go to that we use quite a lot. So one of them is Hannah Glass, who wrote The Art of Cookery. And that's kind of like the Betty Crocker, of the 18th century, like everyone uses her, but she was published multiple times. So every time it sold out, they just published more of it. That's how popular it was. And she writes very much with the idea that, she's giving instructions on how to do things, but also how to shop properly for your meat. So she's a really interesting writer if you want to dig in your teeth into why 18th century cooking is the way that it is. We also use Mary Randolph quite a lot, who's a little bit later, but a lot of her recipes are clearly remnants of the 18th century. But you do find there are reprints of both of these books. So I'll type them into the chat. You can find them very easily online. But then we also sometimes have to dig a little deeper. So our recipe today for the pumpkin fritters came from a book that Colonial Williamsburg published way back in the 1930s the first time, and they republished it in the 1960s. That was a collection of recipes, some of which are not publicly available. So this pumpkin fritter recipe came from someone's private recipe book. So a family recipe book versus a published recipe book.
And I think if you're looking for books that have good modern adaptations in them, and you don't want to dive into the deep end and start making adaptations on historic recipes, There are some really good ones out there, and I'm trying to dig through my brain for those because it's been a while since I've used some of them. Nancy Carter Crump has a book called is it Hearthfire or Hearthside Cooking? Was published in the 90s. That was one of my first forays into this area.
It's backwards, of course, on the screen, but yes, Nancy Crump, Hearthside Cooking.
Yes.
Is that crump with a C?
What?
Yes.
Is it crump with a C?
Yes, like a crumpet.
I'm going to write it in the chat right now.
I'm putting in the chat, but my coworker just told me I only sent it to her, so I'm having to retype it all.
And the other one that's really good, that is kind of a bridge between Nancy Carter Crump, who does provide you with both the historical and the adaptations, is Kate Moss's Seeking the Historical Cook. That one digs through and looks at a variety of different recipes over different time periods and makes comparisons, talks about what's available. She did this really interesting comparison of a dish called a sweet egg pie. I happen to like sweet egg pie. I know that lots of people really, really don't. But she looks at like 15 different recipes over a period of like 100 years and digs into those. I really like that book.
That book's really great too if you're interested too in learning about how we do our work of reading historic recipes and making a modern adaptation of it. Because all these recipes that you have seen us do in this series, we've started with just a historic recipe and then we've had to make our own adaptation of it to share with you. So Kate Moss is really great if you're interested in you know, how do we do what we do?
It's K-A-Y, Laura.
Oh, K-A-Y, thank you.
All right, so I've got one batch each of the fresh pumpkin and the pureed pumpkin on the plate. I know that Laura needs to step away because we've got other things going on here at Gunston Hall, but I will hang out and continue answering questions and cooking more fritters for the next little while. So if you want to hang out with us, you're more than welcome to. I do want to say, if you need to step off, thank you so much for joining us today. We do appreciate that you are spending your Saturday morning with us. This is our last History in the Kitchen session for this year, but we do have more public programs coming up in the near future. In about 2 weeks, on November 13th, we'll be partnering with the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation to talk about supplies during the Revolutionary War, and we'll be rolling the dice, leaving it to chance to see if George Mason can help supply goods to the Army in their time of need. We're also partnering with the Library of Virginia on November 18th to talk about a piece in their collection. It's a copy of the Virginia Declaration of Rights that George Mason wrote in 1778 with annotations. He made it up for a friend. So we're going to get to have a close look at that document on November 18th at 11 o'clock in the morning. So we do appreciate you again. This program, as you all know, is offered complimentary. We love that you're coming out to play with us from all over the world. And this program would not be possible without your support. We are able to offer it on a complimentary basis, but we do appreciate any financial support that you can give us. And you can do that at www.gunstonhall.org/give.